Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to UAF Summer Sessions, University of Alaska Press Authors Corner. Thanks to those of you who are here in the engineering facility for attending in person. I just want to be clear, looks like we're all in compliance here, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows in case they're tuning in online and aren't aware that the University of Alaska Fairbanks has re-implemented a strict COVID-19 policy requiring face coverings and social distancing inside all buildings for everyone, vaccinated or not, in advance of the fall semester. It's coming up. Thanks to those of you who are tuning into live stream or to the video recording later on from Alaska or from anywhere else, for your interest and for your attention. Thanks to University of Alaska Fairbanks Office of Information Technology, to Scott Franzuto and JC Ice, who's here with us tonight. Thanks to Michelle Bartlett and the Summer Sessions for organizing these fun and stimulating summer event series free of charge. Thanks especially to tonight's presenter, John Schoen, and all of our UA Press authors for agreeing to participate in this reading and the Authors Corner series for the whole summer. I do hope you'll make it worth their while. You can find more information and a purchase link for John's book, Tongass Odyssey, at the UA Press website, alaska.edu/UA Press. And I also have some copies here for sale, available after John's presentation tonight. I believe we will have some questions at the end of his presentation. So please consider any information and details you'd like to hear more about as you listen to him. I'll have this microphone here that I can pass around for any questions in the room, and for anybody tuning in on the internet, please use the Google form link on the live stream page. You're probably looking at it right now below the video pane, or visit bit.ly/author Q&A. That's bit.ly/Q&A, author Q&A, no spaces. I also hope you'll consult the calendar for the rest of the summer and make plans to attend any other events that interest you. And we'll post the rest of the scheduled Authors Corner presentations at the conclusion of tonight's event. Yeah, thanks. John Schoen grew up on an island in Washington State and received his PhD from the University of Washington. He has been actively involved in Alaska wildlife conservation science for over 40 years, including 20 years with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and 14 years with Audubon Alaska. His major Alaska research includes ecological studies of brown bears, black-tailed deer, and mountain goats in Southeast Alaska's rainforest. John's work with Audubon has included comprehensive conservation assessments of the Western Arctic and Tongass National Forest. He's also served as an affiliate professor of wildlife biology at the University of Alaska. John has published over 60 scientific and popular articles on Alaska wildlife, and is a co-editor and co-author of the book North Pacific Temperate Rainforests, Ecology and Conservation. His most recent book, Tongass Odyssey, published last year by the University of Alaska Press, is the story of a biologist's personal journey studying the wildlife of Alaska's Tongass National Forest and navigating intense political pressures while advocating for the conservation of an endangered rainforest ecosystem. Excuse me. John and his wife, Mary Beth, live in Anchorage and have 2 grown children working as wildlife and fisheries scientists in Alaska. It's a heck of a legacy. So please join me in welcoming John Schoen.
Thank you, Nate, and good evening, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of my research and conservation experiences on the Tongass National Forest and the importance of conserving one of the Earth's largest and most intact old-growth temperate rainforests. So I'm going to share my screen now and go to a PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay. My goal today is to provide you with a flavor of my new book, Tongass Odyssey. I wrote this not for scientists, but for people interested in natural history, interested in Alaska, forest issues, wildlife. But the book is grounded on hard science. I'll approach my presentation this evening in 3 parts. First, I'll discuss the biology of the Tongass. Next, I'll describe some of the politics of Tongass conservation. And finally, I'll share some personal reflections over the last 4 decades. So here we go. Following my grad work at UW, Mary Beth and I moved to Alaska in 1976, where I began work with ADF&G. In the spring of 1977, I began my deer research out of Juneau with colleagues Charlie Walmo with the research branch of the Forest Service and Matt Kirchhoff with Alaska Fish and Game. In the 1970s, the Forest Service was clear-cutting approximately 18,000 acres of temperate rainforest annually. I vividly remember the first field trip I took to Admiralty Island. Living in Juneau, it was May, and we were flying in a beaver. Charlie Walmo and I headed down to a fish and game research cabin at the head of the south arm of Hood Bay. We turned into Hood Bay out of Chatham Strait and passed a pod of humpback whales, presumably feeding on a school of herring. There were dozens of bald eagles perched in the tops of old growth hemlock and spruce trees. We touched down at the head of the south arm of Hood Bay and taxied into the shore. We got out of the beaver float plane and there were huge, enormous brown bear tracks on the beach at low tide. We could hear ravens and we could hear the hoots of blue grouse, now called dusky grouse, and hermit thrush and varied thrush. And I just couldn't believe it. I was working, I was paid to do this. And I thought, my God, this is almost like a vacation. But it was just an unbelievable experience, that first field trip. Now, I want to back up a little bit and talk about temperate rainforests, kind of set the stage. Temperate rainforests are relatively rare compared to tropical rainforests. They occur at middle and upper latitudes, and they have a maritime climate with roughly 30 to 220 inches of precipitation annually, spread out throughout the year. There are approximately 6 large temperate rainforests around the world, shown in this image and in red. And the largest is the Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest on the west coast of North America. And this rainforest extends from Northern California through Oregon and Washington, British Columbia, all the way up through coastal Alaska, through Prince William Sound to the southern portion of the Kenai Peninsula. The southern portion of this, the largest temperate rainforest on Earth, has largely been logged and is shown in red. The Tongass Forest from Yakutat Bay down to the Canadian border and northern British Columbia is really the largest intact area of temperate rainforest on Earth. And just south of the Tongass Forest, you get into the Great Bear Rainforest of British Columbia, and then to the west of that is Haida Gwaii, formerly called the Queen Charlotte Islands. Now, Southeast Alaska from the Canadian border up to Yakutat Bay spans roughly 500 miles, 16.8 million acres, the largest national forest in the United States. And we have a shoreline of 18,000 miles, over 18,000 miles of marine shoreline and over 5,000 islands. So the island biogeography of this area is really unique. And because of this fragmentation, the natural fragmentation, we have many unique subspecies and even some species that occur, both birds, mammals, and plants in the Alexander Archipelago. Southeast Alaska still has robust populations of fish and wildlife, including some that have dramatically diminished south of our borders and in some cases are now endangered. We have the largest nesting density of bald eagles and marbled murrelets on Earth. We have tremendous salmon populations of all 5 species of Pacific salmon. And the brown bear and black bear populations in the Alexander Archipelago and the adjacent mainland is some of the highest density populations on Earth. Now here we are, just we've landed the beaver float plane in the south arm of Hood Bay, and actually the outer area of Hood Bay. We're unloading our deer, and we're going to live in this Forest Service research wanagon for a week while we're doing some of our initial deer research. This is phase 1 of our deer research that took place on Admiralty Island. And the basic objective of this first phase was to actually measure deer density and habitat use in old growth forest compared to adjacent clear cuts and second growth forest shown on the left. What we found was that old growth had abundant food and high habitat values year round. It had a high overhead canopy that intercepted snow. So there were many snow-free areas in this area in the wintertime and abundant food throughout the entire year. A second growth forest, on the other hand, was a closed canopy, even age stand, little light entering the forest floor. It provided little food for deer and low value year round. Young clear cuts had reasonable amounts of deer forage during snow-free periods, in some cases not as valuable as old growth, but during the snow that occurred in the winter periods, there was very little food available. It was buried by snow, and the movements of deer were very energy expensive. So this was not good habitat during winter. Let me just recap what an old growth forest is. These are forests with old trees. The average age of trees in these stands was over 300 years. They included all ages and sizes of trees, from seedlings and saplings to pole-sized trees up to very large trees that exceeded, in some cases, 800 to 1,000 years of age. These forests have broken canopies, multi-layered canopies that allow much light to enter the forest and penetrate the forest floor, which resulted in an abundance of forest floor plants. Another characteristic of old growth forests are the dead and down trees, or snags, that occur in these forests that also provide a lot of habitat for a variety of species. Now, this is looking at an old growth canopy out of a small airplane that I was flying, and it gives you the sense of this very broken, ragged structure of the forest canopy in old growth. And the silver snags, the dead trees that are sticking up, this is part of what makes an old growth forest. And here's another view from a little further distance of an old growth surrounded by second growth forest. This is on northern Prince of Wales Island, which has been extensively logged. And you can see that the structure of the forest between second growth and old growth is really quite distinct. Now, this is really a fundamental point that people need to understand if they want to understand the relationship of forest management to wildlife. The left photo is a second growth forest that's 50 years old. The right photo is an old growth forest. You can just see from the forest structure that they're dramatically different. And the forest on the right, the old growth forest, has these ancient trees. It takes centuries, 2 to 3 centuries, to begin to develop the characteristics of old growth forest. When old growth forest is cut on relatively short timber rotations of 100 years, they're basically non-renewable. So as the old growth has been harvested across the country and around the world, it's become very rare. Now, a little more background information. The large Tongass forest, 16.8 million acres of a forest. Well, not all of the forest, of the Tongass forest is actually forest land. Roughly forests only cover about 60% or less of the Tongass. You have major ice fields and glaciers and rock. You have alpine, high elevation alpine, subalpine habitats. You have muskeg bog habitats, steep avalanche slopes. And then you have the productive old growth forest, which only makes up 30% of the Tongass land base. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, and it's very easy to misuse statistics. So the productive old growth forest, again, represents only about 30% of the Tongass land base. Now, another key factor, all old growth is not the same. Old growth is highly variable. The lower left photo is a large tree old growth. These forests occur on limestone karst substrates or gravel and well-drained slopes. The picture on the upper right is a small tree old growth that occurs on poorly drained soils, and these are the edges of muskegs. This particular forest happens to be an Alaska cedar stand. The lower left photo is a mixed hemlock spruce stand. This is classified as a large tree old growth forest. It makes up only 3% of the land base of the Tongass National Forest. This is a critical factor. Now, this makes it even more complicated. The largest trees are very rare. Less than half of 1% of the Tongass land base includes a forest like this. This was on at South Bay on Baranof Island. That's Mary Beth standing between two very large Sitka spruce trees. The one on the left is 6 to 8 feet in diameter. Again, forests like this were always rare on the Tongass. And these forests and the large tree forest in general have always been the target of timber harvest. And we call this high grading, targeting the best and leaving the rest. Now, phase 2 of the deer research, after we identified old growth as really being essential habitat, phase 2 of the deer research focused on radio collaring individual deer. And we captured and radio collared about 50 deer on Admiralty Island in 2 different study sites. The photo on the left shows Matt Kirchhoff, which is the right individual, with a captured Sitka black-tailed deer. The red underneath the deer is not blood, it's actually a net. We captured this deer using a net gun out of a helicopter. Then we would radio track these deer at least once a week and throughout the year, and identify what kinds of habitat they were using throughout different seasons. I'm standing in front of the Super Cub that we use to radio track deer. We also used a helio courier, and you can see the antennas. We had 2 antennas pointing out each side of the airplane, and we could isolate the deer, which side it was, and we could continue making circles around the deer until we located them within an acre. I might just say that I've been a pilot for over 50 years. I learned to fly. My dad taught me to fly, and I did almost all of my own research flying for goats, deer, and brown bear in my research down there. And unlike many parts of the country, instead of driving our pickup truck out to our study area, we used boats or airplanes. And the airplanes we flew, we often landed on the beaches. Those are the only landing strips we had. Now, what we learned with the deer habitat use is that their habitat use varies dramatically season by season. In the summertime, deer range from sea level all the way up to the subalpine and alpine habitats up to 3,000 feet. There was an abundance of productive forage for deer. During the winter, snow forced deer down to the old growth forest at lower elevations. And this was a bottleneck. And this is when that habitat, that old growth forest habitat is very important. Now, here's a view looking at the forest mosaic in the wintertime. This is a patchwork quilt. And here we have, with my cursor, we have a muskeg bog with scrub forest, small tree forest, some medium tree size forest, and then some large tree forest identified in red. And what we found was during the significant snowfall, deer focused most of their foraging in the rare large tree forest, especially on southern slopes at low elevations. So the deer were very selective in the habitat they chose. These were the habitats that had the most abundant forage and had the least ecological cost of travel. Now, this is a photo from central Prince of Wales Island, been heavily logged. This is a muskeg down the lower left of the photo. This is some mid to high volume old growth here, second growth forest, and these are clear cuts. This is an example of high grading, taking the very best timber out of this area, which unfortunately happens to be the very best deer habitat. And this habitat is also important for bald eagle nesting and for goshawks and for marten and for brown bear and for salmon that spawn in the riparian forest stands along the stream sides. So this is high grading, and it really poses significant problems for fish and wildlife in the Tongass. I'm going to shift gears. My book, I talk about a lot of these personal experiences, and I've blended a little bit of my family life in them because I got my family out in some of my research, and I think it's an interesting story. We moved to Juneau. The first year we lived in a duplex in a subdivision, and we thought we didn't move to Alaska to be in a suburbia duplex. So we started looking for waterfront property, and we couldn't find any that would fit our budget. We were fresh out of graduate school, but we did find an acre on the Mendenhall Peninsula where that red arrow is, Smuggler's Cove, and it didn't have a road and it didn't have power or telephone. It was off the grid. So we bought that acre of property, we built our own home, and we commuted by boat every day for work. And we raised our two children there. That's Mary Beth in the skiff. We had an outhaul at each end, and we drive to work. We burned wood and lived totally off the grid. That was Sarah, and she was, I don't know, about 3 years old in that picture. And this is Eric. I drugged them along on some of my research in Southeast. And today, Sarah is a seabird biologist with Alaska Science Center here in Juneau. And Eric is in Anchorage. And Eric is a research professor at UAF with the International Arctic Research Center. So a little bit of that, I guess, rubbed off, but they're very active, especially in climate change in Alaska. Now, I started my brown bear research in 1981. Before I ended the deer research, Matt Kirchhoff later took on the deer research as the principal investigator. But I started the bear research in 81, and we started capturing brown bears. It was a tremendous experience. And here's a photograph up on a slope on Admiralty Island. This is Bear 46, a 550-pound, 11-year-old male. And that's Laverne Beyer, who worked with me on this project. And you can see the radio collar around the bear. We captured bears in leg hole snares along fish streams, and also darting them out of helicopters up in the alpine or in the large river deltas. And life begins in the den. Bears are large-bodied animals. They require very high-quality food. And when high-quality food isn't available in the winter, they've evolved and adapted to going into hibernation. It really is a type of hibernation, not like a ground squirrel. They're awakened easily and their temperature doesn't drop, but their respiration drops. And for 5 to 7 months of the year, they spend their time in a den. On Admiralty Island, in Chichikov Island, where I did the brown bear research, they often denned under large Sitka spruce, western hemlock, old growth trees under the root wads or in rock caves. And I'm going to tell you a story about this den here. This was up on a slope on Admiralty Island. This was bear number 60, a female with a 2-year-old cub that spent the winter there. And we had dropped a radio collar over the top of this den, generally where we thought it was from the super cub. And then in May, we went in to identify and measure the den. And Laverne and our helicopter pilot had me by the feet, and I was sliding into this den, and my head had just gone into this rock cave that was just about big enough to get my shoulders in. And I said, stop. My stress level was redlining because the radio transmitter was still transmitting from inside the den. Now, we were 99% sure that that bear wasn't in the den because we'd seen her at the den site with her cub the week before. But it took a little bit of getting my courage up to go down. I said, okay, let me go. And I went in, and sure enough, the radio had been slipped off. It was in the nest at the end of this 10-foot rock cave. Anyway, that's one story. I've got lots of stories in the book, and just an amazing experience doing research there. Briefly, seasonal habitat use of brown bears. They leave the dens in April through May. The males are the first out. The females with cubs are the last out. They head down to lower elevations generally. They feed on sedges, skunk cabbage roots, maybe herring eggs, dead deer, whatever they can get their paws on. And then as the snow melts, they move up into higher elevations on Admiralty Island, and they're distributed from sea level to the alpine, where they've got a tremendous amount of forage available and small mammals. They eat roots and so on. By early July, most of the bears, not all of them, but most of the bears head down to fish streams where they spend time dealing with the fish that are moving into the streams. And they're still eating berries, and they are eating berries into the fall. And by October, when most of the fish have kind of moved on or spawned out, the bears move up into higher elevations, top off their tanks with berries, and then look for a denning place, usually by October and November. So riparian old growth is one of the key habitats for brown bears on Admiralty and Chichagof Island and in Southeast in general. This is great spawning and rearing habitat. We've got millions of salmon that come in that spawn in thousands of spawning rivers and streams in Southeast Alaska. In our area, pink and chum salmon were the primary fish. And a female bear can take as much as 2,000 pounds of fish in a season. And salmon are really anchor the productivity of South coastal Alaska. And over 100 species of birds, mammals, fish, and vertebrates utilize salmon as a resource. Now, what are the impacts of logging on brown bears? Clear-cut logging reduces habitat value. Old growth has higher habitat value throughout the active bear season than clear cuts, and certainly higher than second growth forest. Some of the same relationships between second growth and bears and second growth and deer. Roads also increase bear-human interactions, which leads to increased mortality risk for bears. So generally, logging is a detrimental impact on brown bears. Very briefly, most of my work was done with mammals, but birds are very important on the Tongass. We have 300 species of birds that use the Tongass. Northern goshawks and bald eagles nest in old growth forest. The goshawk and the spruce grouse have endemic subspecies in Southeast Alaska. A variety of woodpeckers use the forest, hairy woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers. Woodpeckers make cavities that are used by cavity nesting birds like nuthatches and chickadees. And then there's the marbled murrelet. This is a small seabird that nests in the tops. Many marbled murrelets nest in the high limbs of large old growth trees that are covered with mosses. I retired from ADF&G in '96 and went to work for Audubon, Alaska, and spent 14 years working for Audubon. And later I served on the Audubon board. One of the big projects I did at Audubon was to continue the Tongass work. And Audubon formed a partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And this is a picture of myself with my airplane when I'm working with Audubon with Dave Albert, who is a spatial ecologist with TNC based in Juneau. And we developed an ecological assessment of Southeast Alaska and the Tongass. And I'm going to hit a couple of the high points. Now, many of you may know that there are over 6 million acres of wilderness and roadless areas in the Tongass. So what's the problem with a little bit of logging? Well, our analysis clearly demonstrated that logging targeted the low quality forest lands like Tracy Arm Forge Terror Wilderness or the Misty Fjords National Monument or the South Prince of Wales Wilderness. These are areas that had very low timber values. In contrast, logging on the Tongass targeted the best forest lands. This is the Maybe-So Valley on Prince of Wales Island. And this was done in the old days. And you can see the top of the fringe of old growth. And this was a major clear cut, covered the entire valley. In the 70s, when I started to work, they no longer cut major valleys, but they would cut a patchwork of forest, clear cuts that range from 60 to 100 acres in size. Again, this is muskeg, but you can see that the logging in the 70s and 80s, even though it was done in a patchwork, still targeted the best timber lands. Native corporations had lands from the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and many of their lands targeted high timber values and were extensively logged. One thing that we learned, that Dave Albert and I learned from our work, is that high grading actually picked up about 50% or about half of the high volume or the large tree old growth forest. On Prince of Wales Island, on the northern portion of Prince of Wales Island, which was the most productive forest lands in all of Alaska, we found that contiguous large tree old growth was reduced from 1954 to 2004 by 94%. Now, there's still a lot of old growth, but the large tree old growth was targeted, and this is the best habitat for salmon and brown bears and black bears, black-tailed deer, goshawks, marbled murrelets, and a number of fish and wildlife species. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, and I'm going to talk about some of the science and politics. Doing field research on the Tongass was truly an awesome experience. I'll remember it all my life, really the high point of my career. But that was balanced with the raw politics of timber. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. After phase 1 of our deer research, Charlie Walmo and I began work on a paper describing our early deer work. And we submitted that to some of the top deer biologists in North America for peer review. We received high marks. Charlie also submitted it to the research station that sent it to the regional forester, the region that manages the timber. And that was farmed out to timber managers and regional staff of the Forest Service, and they gave it low marks. And the regional forester sent a memo to Charlie and his supervisor, and here's a quote out of the memo. And I wonder if we can move that a little bit, okay? We believe the manuscript needs substantial additions and clarifications if it is to make a positive contribution to our understanding of this controversial subject. Well, this was a clear attempt to kill or delay this publication. Fortunately, the research station said, go for it. and we submitted it to Forest Science, and it was published in 1980. So another example, in 1986, I was invited to testify before a congressional hearing at the US House in Washington, DC. The state of Alaska told Congress that I was unavailable. Well, that wasn't quite true. I talked to my supervisors at Fish and Game, and I discussed it with Mary Beth, and I decided that I was working for the public interest. We had this scientific data, and I had a responsibility to go back to testify. So I took annual leave, and I went back and testified on behalf of the Wildlife Society here in DC. And what I did was to show a slideshow. Some of the slides I'm showing this evening were included in that slideshow. Slides were worth 1,000 words. The key points I made is that old growth forests are rare. Old growth forests are diverse and productive habitats for wildlife, and old growth forests are non-renewable. Well, the next day, the chief of the Forest Service testified. And he said, we intend our management program to include in perpetuity a viable population of black-tailed deer, and we are affecting less than 1/10 of 1% of the Tongass forest annually, and we're affecting only a small part of old growth. Well, that was true, but it only tells about a small part of the story. Recall that only 30% of the Tongass is commercial forest land, only 3% is large tree old growth, and the best forest is high grade. Well, Congressman Seiberling followed up and made that point, and the Tongass Timber Reform Act passed in 1990 and protected some key areas. Now, from 90 to 2000, scientists were really focused in on the fact that old growth was valuable fish and wildlife habitat, and it was not renewable. In 2015, I was involved with some other scientists, and we prepared a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, who's again the Secretary of Agriculture. And among other things, we asked him to end clear-cut logging of old growth forest during the Tongass Forest Plan Amendment. That was January 2015. There were 7 scientific societies that signed on to that letter. That's not an easy thing to do. Those societies included American Fisheries Society, the Wildlife Society, the Ecological Society of America, and others. And the combined membership represents about 30,000 scientists. So where was the Tongass last year during the last administration? In the year 2020, there was an accelerated plan to continue clear cutting old growth, and the Tongass forest was exempted from the National Rodents Rule. That was a really significant impact and a concern. In July of this year, just a month ago, Secretary Tom Vilsack announced an end to large-scale old growth timber sales in the Tongass. And he said that they would restore the roadless rule, which protects 9 million acres of the Tongass from logging and road building. Now, not all the 9 million acres have good timber, but what that would allow is that continued high grading to go into some of those key places. So basically, we have the last opportunity to conserve an old growth forest with all its functional parts. I began my research in '77, and during that time, my thinking evolved from a single species of focus to an ecosystem perspective. My goal for this book, Tongass Odyssey, was to document the ecological impact of forest management on the Tongass and what we've learned over the last 4 decades of research. For over 30 years, scientists have understood the ecological values of old growth and realized that clear-cutting these forests was not sustainable. But national and regional leadership of the Tongass was slow to change and failed to integrate new science into forest management. Continued clear cutting of old growth will place at risk many sustainable resource uses, from subsistence use of fish and wildlife to commercial and sport fishing, tourism and outdoor recreation, as well as carbon storage. Now, this is a big deal. Climate change is real. The Tongass is one of the largest carbon sinks in the US and plays a valuable role in helping mitigate climate change. It's our responsibility as good stewards not to let short-term economic gain foreclose our ability to maintain the long-term sustainability and ecological integrity of our public lands and waters. So, this administration's new conservation measures are very significant, but administrative actions are subject to change, as we all know. I encourage you to support the good conservation work of organizations like Audubon and SEAC, the Nature Conservancy, Alaska Wilderness League, Salmon State, and others. It's important to use your voices to urge decision makers to end clear-cut logging of Tongass old growth and conserve this national treasure for our children and grandchildren. Thank you, and I'd be happy to entertain some questions.
Thanks so much, John. Fascinating work, really, really terrific, stunning pictures, and really appreciate the story that you have to tell. We do have some folks in the room here. Does anybody have any questions for John immediately? I can, happy to prime the pump a little bit. Yeah, Paolo, here's a microphone for people listening online.
Let's see if you can hear me okay. My most important questions you just answered in the last few slides between the previous administration and of course this has been in the news, and the present. And so it's a relief that something changed. Something you may or may not be able to answer is, since we're in Fairbanks, early on, 1905, 1907, the Tanana Valley Railroad was built, and it lasted until 1931, and it was the backbone. And that's how everybody got the work done here. And what happened is Wickersham and Teddy Roosevelt tried to stop, and they successfully stopped the coal from being developed, which meant that that railroad, very uniquely, was run off of wood. Everybody heated with wood. The mining in the Fairbanks area was deep, and it needed wood to burn down. So there was no wood standing within 30 miles of the railroad. Everything was cut down. If that had not happened, can you guess what Fairbanks, the difference might be now in the forest around this town, as opposed to running a railroad on wood, which you can't do? So we were clear cut.
Well, the boreal forest is a little different than the temperate rainforest in that it's a fire forest. So where we have 1,000-year-old trees, not all the trees are 1,000-year-old, but we have 300, 500, 800,000-year-old trees. Up in the boreal forest, in the fire forest, most of your forest is not nearly as old. You still have old growth. It's just a different kind of old growth. I suspect that some of the forest that was logged, if it wasn't logged for lumber, it was logged for fuel, as you say. So I'm not sure that the same kind of high grading went on, where down in Southeast we're high grading for the big trees. I'm not an expert on the boreal forest, but I do see some differences between the Tongass and interior Alaska. I do have some concerns about logging the large white spruce in the riparian areas along your river corridors, because those are very valuable wildlife habitats for birds and other species and provide integrity to the stream systems and so on. But I think that there are probably some substantial differences between the Tongass and the boreal forest up in Fairbanks.
Thanks, John. Anybody else here? Don't be shy. Raise your hand if something comes to you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir. Thanks again for your talk. It was actually very informative. I have 7 acres between the university and Esther. I've had it for about 40 years. Tremendous changes in the last few years. One thing is this black spruce, and the permafrost is melting, so the taiga has shot up. One of my concerns is that of 7 acres of forest, there are a lot of dead trees standing and a lot of self-pruning of the black spruce, which are, of course, and this is not quite Tongass, what I might call a tree, you would call an arboreal weed, I think.
Yeah.
But they're 40 and 50 foot high. And these forests are very, very eager to burn. And that's something we should locally be concerned about, because if it got started, it could overrun us. Any suggestions?
Well, you're right on target. Black spruce is very vulnerable. And with climate change going on, I think that we're going to see some very significant impacts and changes to Alaska and to the boreal forest. Glenn Juday in the College of Natural Resources there at UAF would be a great person to talk to about this question, because he's done a lot of work in the boreal forest and knows a lot more about black spruce than I do. But I think you're absolutely right. With climate change and so on, we're going to see some big changes. One of the things that I've noticed, we lived in Fairbanks for 3 years, and our son, of course, lives in Fairbanks. And we just drove up there this spring, and between Talkeetna and Broad Pass, it seemed like 90% of the mature white spruce had been beetle killed. So that's another big issue going on. And I don't think you have spruce bark beetle as far north as Fairbanks, but they're right up on your doorstep. So big issues. But I suggest you talk to Glenn Juday about this black spruce issue. I think he could give you a lot more specific information than I can.
Thanks, John.
Thank you very much. I'm curious what percentage of old growth is left in the Tongass, and if the definition of old growth is 100 years or more, might there be an increase? Could we expect any increase in that overall percentage of old growth a few decades from now, if recultivation or words like that might be used?
Well, this is a very good question, and it gets to the heart of one of the problematic issues here. Old growth, 100 years isn't old growth. We've actually measured deer use in a 150-year-old second growth, and the trees are much bigger than a 50-year-old stand, of course, but there's virtually nothing green on the forest floor. A little bit of ferns, but an old growth forest really starts beginning to develop, a second growth forest, the result of fire or logging, really begins to develop old growth characteristics after 2 centuries. And, it starts to get into old growth about 300 years. So much of the old growth on the Tongass, is literally centuries old, because, the death of old trees, the new trees come in. Wind is a major disturbance factor on the Tongass, and often individual patches of trees go down as big as an acre to 5 acres, and sometimes 25 or 30 acres. Fire is rare on the Tongass. There's a lot of old growth left. I think that if you look at the whole Tongass, only about 3% of the forest has been logged, but 50% of the big tree forest has been logged. And the really largest trees, they're very hard to find anymore. So what we've done, we've dramatically changed the ecological structure and the diversity of the forest. old growth is not all the same. So the diversity of the old growth forest has changed. That's going to have a huge impact on fish and wildlife. Does that help answer your question? There's a lot of old growth left, but some of the most valuable fish and wildlife habitat, the large tree stands have been selected for and significantly taken out of proportion to their occurrence.
Terrific. Okay. Yeah, please don't be shy here in the room. And I've also got the sheet pulled up here for anybody tuning in online. So please don't hesitate to type in your question there. I wonder, John, you talked about your own the start to your study in the Tongass, your arrival in Alaska. I guess I wonder if you could say a thing or two about how you got interested in wildlife and ecosystem science originally, and are there people or experiences that you credit for prompting your study and your
Oh,
career?
absolutely. Again, I grew up on Orcas Island on 100 acres, an old farm. Had a saltwater beach in my front yard, and backyard were forests and meadows. I raised animals. I had a horse. My dad had boats in his business. For a summer vacation, we'd go up on the west coast of Vancouver Island or up the BC coast before tourists were taking pleasure boats up there. And, I went to college. My dad was a businessman, so I thought I would be major in economics. I got a D in economics. I talk about that in the book. Biology was easy, so biology is where I went. And I really enjoyed it. And I took a marine biology course, and we went diving at Deception Pass, and we went out and collected marine animals, and then we categorize them and work on them in the lab and have a big bonfire at night, much like Cannery Row with Doc, Steinbeck's book. I just got into biology. It was interesting to me. And I love being outdoors. I like airplanes and boats, and I've used both in my work. I'm a very, very fortunate man who's been able to live my dream and do things that I think are important. And that's conservation. But, our kids, Mary Beth and I have two kids that are actively involved in biological sciences in Alaska. And we packed them around, and we took a boat to our house every day when we lived in Juneau. So I think children are sponges for nature, and I think that anybody who has a chance to get their kids out in nature, it gives the kids a real opportunity.
Yeah, well said. So I guess that kind of connects to my other question, which is the work that you talk about tracking and studying deers and bears and other wildlife. I wonder if you have ideas about I'm just curious about how that might be different, how it might look different or feel different if you were starting out today. I'm thinking mostly about like differences or developments in technology and the upsides and downsides of those differences.
Well, there are a lot of differences. When I was doing radio tracking, when I was working on my PhD on elk and the west slope of the Washington Cascades, we radio collared elk, and that was new then. And we drive around in a big van with a 14-foot antenna on top of the van. And my work here in Alaska was using airplanes. And now you can go put a radio collar on a brown bear, and the satellites will monitor it every minute. You can sit in your office and download this data. It's just amazing. And you can put radio tags on songbirds. You can imagine a bear can take a big radio, or a deer, or an elk, but the technology has dramatically improved, and the sophistication of computers and the sophistication of the data analysis, the new biometric analyses is just really different. I'm kind of a dinosaur now. I've been out of that for a while, but we have opportunities today that are tremendous. To tell you the truth, I think our science is so far ahead of the implementation of our knowledge. I mean, right now, there are a lot of people that don't believe in climate change. And if you've been reading the paper this week, you know, the new Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just came out, and it paints a dire picture. We need to get our act together. And I think that the challenge is for scientists to communicate effectively with the public and with politicians. I think that's going to be a huge new dimension that we have to deal with. And, you know, I give University of Alaska Press credit. You know, you've published a number of science books, and scientists need to do a better job communicating with public so the public understands what various options are and what impacts of certain kinds of development are. So yeah, a lot of changes.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you saying that. I think we have time for one more question if anybody has anything in the room, but I'm also happy to just ask you if, you know, your work from my perspective, you know, it seems urgent, but I think in a lot of ways it sounds to me like, and it reads to me like your work in the Tongass and advocating for it seems like a success. And so do you think there are big picture lessons that we can take from your work and your experiences to apply to other arenas of conservation work?
Yes, I do. And I think that a number of scientists around the country and around the world are becoming more active in communicating with the public. I think that we need to communicate with management agencies. You know, administrations come and go, and the last administration and the current administration are quite different. I think that that individual scientists have a responsibility and an obligation to take their science to the public. We all know that publishing in peer-reviewed journals is very important, it's fundamental. But how many people read peer-reviewed journals? I think that we all have a responsibility to do a better job of communication. And I think that's going on. And I think that professional societies like the Wildlife Society, the Ecological Society of America, the American Fisheries Society, the American Society of Foresters, those organizations are starting to play a more effective role in the policy arena. So I think that's important. But to come back, I think that our technology and our ability to answer questions has so improved. Right now, the challenge is to help the American public understand what science is, how to use science effectively. Science doesn't give you the answer to a management decision, but it gives you information to make informed decisions. And that's a key issue. And whether it's COVID-19 or it's logging old growth forest or it's managing fisheries with ocean acidification, we need informed decisions from the managers.
Terrific. Thanks so much, John. Well said. Thanks for being here. Thanks for presenting tonight. Greatly appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who came and joined us in person. Thanks everybody tuning in online. Yeah, one more round of applause for John Schoen in the room here. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nate. Been a pleasure.